There is grandeur in this view of life.
Welcome to Evolution Talk with Rick Coast, an introduction to the oldest story ever told.
When I was in the 4th grade, a classmate came up to me and told me that I and pretty much everyone in my family had come from apes. I, of course, defended my family's honor by telling him that his family came from worms, and I stewed about it all day long. When the bus pulled up in front of my house, I stormed out, went up to my mother, and I asked her. Imagine my surprise when she told me that, yes, some people think that we come from monkeys. This to me was worse. Not only the kid at school thought that, but now I knew that some people thought that. Which people, I had no idea at all, but the fact that there were people out there who probably thought, there goes the monkey family when we went by, troubled me. Troubled me is an understatement. I obsessed over it. How could I come from a monkey? And then I came across a picture. You'll know the picture I'm talking about. It's the one in silhouette which starts out as a monkey and gradually progresses to a walking upright man. I came across this image in a library book quite unexpectedly, and I sat there staring at it. You could have heard a pin drop. In those days, libraries were much quieter. Here in black and white was proof. Although this wasn't my family, this was every family. And the picture even had a name. It was titled The Evolution of Man. I wish I still had that book today, because the picture is everywhere, but that book, whatever it was, set me on a path to learn everything I could about my family tree. Only now it was more than my family tree. It was the family tree with capital letters. Most of what I read in the paragraphs under that image made little sense to me. It might as well have been written in ancient Sanskrit, but I got the gist of it. We and everyone I know, no, let me change that. Everything I know descended from the same thing if we went back far enough. And by far enough, it meant going back quite a ways. A billion ways back. That image is incredibly deceptive, the one of the monkeys evolving into a man, and by no means illustrates the true descent of man from an ancient ancestor. But all of that aside, I also had a name now. A name I had heard but had never known much about. I knew this man was important, like, say, Abraham Lincoln or Ben Franklin was important. But this man's name was singular. I didn't think he even had a first name at the time. His name was Darwin. Charles Darwin will be forever known as the man who came up with the brilliant and magnificent idea that life evolved on this planet from a common ancestor, and that the driver or the mechanism behind this is natural selection. Evolution is as true today as it has been for the past 3 billion years or more, and it will be true in the future. And to think that had Charles Darwin not stepped on board a little ship called the HMS Beagle as a young man of 22 years old and sailed around the world collecting specimens and capturing his thoughts in his notebooks, we may never have been gifted with this idea. But to truly appreciate this idea of his, the one which changed the course of history, we must dial the hands of the clock a little bit further back. Not centuries, but decades. Decades before Darwin. Back to another ancestor, only this time one of Charles' ancestors. I would like to introduce you to Charles Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin. Charles never knew his grandfather. Charles was born in 1809, and Erasmus Darwin, a physician and a poet who loved to spend hours thinking about nature and our place in it, died in 1802, 7 years before Charles was even born. He was also a writer who, in 1794, published a little book called Zoonomia.
Would it be too bold to imagine,
that's Erasmus Darwin from section 49 of Zoonomia,
that in the great length of time since the earth began to exist, perhaps millions of ages before the commencement of the history of mankind, would it be too bold to imagine that all warm-blooded animals have arisen from one living filament?
It's that last line which captures the attention, that all warm-blooded animals have arisen from one living filament. Had he used the words common ancestor instead of filament, we would be looking at an early argument that we all, and by all I do mean all, evolved from a single organism, just one. Everything that you see around you, all evidence of life from the trees to birds to your next-door neighbor even, evolved from one thing, one small living filament that was granted with the ability to self-replicate. Now, this is only one small section of a book which includes thoughts on sleep, drunkenness, and black stools. Yes, I said stools. But there is another little phrase in the book which, if the young Charles Darwin read it, as he most assuredly did at one time in his young life, it must have sat in his imagination to germinate, waiting for the right season in order to bloom.
The strongest and most active animal should propagate the species, which should thence become improved.
If there was ever a phrase that screamed survival of the fittest without actually saying the words, it's this one. Again, this is a small section in a book loaded with facts, thoughts, and ideas, but the impact this section had to have had on the writer's grandson can't be underestimated. One can imagine a young Charles Darwin asking to read his father's copy of Zoonomia and skipping to the good parts while breezing over sections about animals evolving from a single filament while struggling to survive. One can also imagine his mother reading to him while he struggled to stay awake.
I had previously read the Zoonomia of my grandfather, in which similar views are maintained, but without producing any effect on me.
That's Charles. However it happened, the seed was planted and it would take a half-century for that seed to burst from the fertile ground of his imagination. Charles's father, Robert Darwin, was no slouch either. Robert was a physician in Shrewsbury, where he and his wife had 6 children, Charles being the 5th. His wife, Robert's wife, Susanna, was the daughter of Josiah Wedgwood, and Wedgwood and Erasmus Darwin were great friends, and it's said that they arranged the marriage between Robert and Susanna. Whatever the truth may be, the fact remains that they lived happily together until her death in 1817. Charles was only 8. The Wedgwoods, while being his mother's side of the family, would continue to play a major role in Charles's life, as we will see. Charles was born on February 12, 1809 in Shrewsbury, and would later go on to say that he had a very happy childhood, with the sole exception, of course, being the death of his mother. He worshipped his father Robert, and after his mother's death, most of his maternal rearing came by way of his older sisters.
I can say in my own favour that I was a boy humane, but I owe this entirely to the instruction and example of my sisters.
Charles, it must be said, wasn't a great student. He was easily distracted and found much of what he was being taught not worthy of his complete attention. He had, by his own admission in his autobiography, a penchant for long, solitary walks. He would continue this practice of walking and thinking for the rest of his life, actually. And as an older man, when he had secured his own home, he even went so far as to purchase an adjacent 3 acres of property that would serve as his own private walking path, now called Darwin's Sandwalk. The products of these walks would fill the pages of his books, but whatever thoughts he had as a young boy who liked to walk for hours alone is now, unfortunately, forever lost in time. The fact that Charles would one day change the world of science wasn't something that ever crossed anyone's mind, least of all his father's. Robert's desire to see his son do well in his studies was constantly thwarted by Charles himself. His performance in school was nothing to write home about, and when he wasn't shooting birds, he was collecting bugs, all when he should have been paying attention to what the headmaster was saying.
To my deep mortification, my father once said to me, "You care for nothing but shooting, dogs, and rat-catching, and you will be a disgrace to yourself and all your family." But my father, who was the kindest man I ever knew, and whose memory I love with all my heart, must have been angry and somewhat unjust when he used such words.
Disgrace or not, it was time Charles stopped wasting time and do something more useful. So his father pulled him from school, a habit he was unfortunately going to become quite a master at, and Charles became a medical assistant. After some time at this, Charles did pull it together enough to be sent to Edinburgh University, both his father's and his grandfather's school, where, like his father, he was going to study medicine. It is worth mentioning at this point that Charles held a great reverence for his uncle on his mother's side, Josiah Wedgwood II. If you recall, it was Josiah's father and Erasmus Darwin who had arranged the coupling of Robert and Susanna, Charles's parents. A most fortuitous event, as it produced Charles, although Robert couldn't have foreseen how fortuitous an event that was for many years to come. The fact remains, however, that Josiah Wedgwood would play two major roles in Charles's life. One is for being the father of Charles's cousin Emma Wedgwood, whom Charles would eventually fall in love with and marry. His other role? Well, we'll get to that in a few minutes. Needless to say, without Josiah Wedgwood, the world, or at least the world of science, would look a whole lot different than it does today.
I was also attached to and greatly revered my Uncle Josiah. He was silent and reserved, so as to be a rather awful man. But he sometimes talked openly with me. He was the very type of an upright man, with the clearest judgment. I do not believe that any power on earth could have made him swerve an inch from what he considered the right course.
When he wasn't taking trips to Paris and falling in love with his cousin, Charles continued his studies at Edinburgh. If Robert was beginning to feel pleased at his son's progress, any such pleasure was soon to be tested, and tested sorely, I might add.
After having spent 2 sessions in Edinburgh, my father perceived, or he heard from my sisters, that I did not like the thought of being a physician. So he proposed that I should become a clergyman.
So once again, Robert stepped in to pull Charles from school. A nasty habit I am sure Robert could have done without. And at this point, he wasn't quite sure what to do with his son. He knew the boy was clever and a good shot, but being a clever sportsman wouldn't really do much good to anyone. So it was off to Christ's College in Cambridge for Charles and life as a clergyman. Charles, who had decided that following in his father's footsteps as a physician wasn't a path he really wanted to follow, wasn't as dismayed as you might think about the prospect of becoming a country parson. The life of a parson could be a quiet one. When he wasn't attending to those who attended whatever church he would eventually be assigned to, he could take quiet walks and study his newfound love of natural history. It was at Cambridge that this interest would grab Charles by his shirt collar and drag him into his future. It requires mentioning as well of another relationship that would have an immense influence on Darwin's career, probably more than any others, and that was his friendship with Professor Henslow. Professor Henslow, a botanist, was by all accounts a good man, just the sort of man who could cultivate in the mind of young Charles the seeds of interest that, up to this point, had been pushed aside for less inventive pursuits. At Cambridge, he became well acquainted with Henslow after taking long walks with him. Long enough and often enough that he was called by some the man who walks with Henslow. It was Henslow who introduced Charles to a world he had not before quite appreciated to the extent that he could have, that being the world around him. And of the other role that Henslow would play in Charles's life, well, if not for Henslow's connections and faith in his young pupil, the age of 22 would have passed quietly for Charles. Instead, something remarkable happened which may not have happened at all.
On returning from my short geological tour in North Wales, I found a letter from Henslow informing me that Captain Fitzroy was willing to give up part of his own cabin to any young man who would volunteer to go with him, without pay, as naturalist to the voyage of the Beagle. I will here only say that I was instantly eager to accept the offer, but my father strongly objected, adding the words, fortunate for me, "If you can find any man of common sense who advises you to go, I will give my consent." So I wrote that evening and refused the offer. On the next morning I went to Myer to be ready for September the 1st, and, whilst out shooting, my uncle sent for me, offering to drive me over to Shrewsbury and talk with my father, as my uncle thought it would be wise in me to accept the offer. My father always maintained that he was one of the most sensible men in the world, and he at once consented in the kindest manner.
It looks like Charles's life was going to take a most unexpected turn for both him and the history of science.
Evolution Talk is a Rick Coast production.